All right, everybody, welcome back to I'm calling it the Grounded Seeker podcast. This is episode 2. I don't know if that's going to change that name. I just wanted to put something on the podcast name just to get it out there and not worry too much about the name. So definitely give me a feedback if you think it's cringy or what you think of that name, the Grounded Seeker. I'm going to roll with it for now. This episode, I want to talk about probably the most important skill that we can cultivate, recognition of our true self, the true self. So, truly it is. The people listening to this podcast, I would imagine you're a serious non-dual seeker. So you already have an understanding of what the true self is. You're already doing self-inquiry. You're already asking questions like, who am I? What is this? Looking to understand and connect to your true nature. And yet we're still experiencing emotional distress to some degree. So this episode is essentially going to go into, a lot more depth as to the application of the true self, if we can call it an application, right? Because really, once we recognize our true self, it permeates all of experience in an ongoing way. Although there does require some degree of a recognition of its presence before we realize that it's always been here and always been the case. And when we do recognize it, it gives us access to probably the most important foundational piece if we're interested in deep emotional healing and integration work and truly transforming the heart at the deep level. So this is a foundational episode. I'm trying to go over the more foundational things as to build more of a basis for people to come back to and to essentially educate themselves on the necessary things that we need in order to really integrate our heart. Because ultimately where I want to be taking people is the non-dual seeker who is looking to heal, looking to integrate, looking to be embody their realization of their awakening, their true nature in daily life, and to really alchemize the heart. And this skill, or we'll call it a skill, but it's a recognition of what's already always been the case, sets the foundation. And I'll go into the nuances here. So, what is it like to not have this recognition? Because there might be some people who are practicing in the non-dual space, like asking, who am I? What is this? Where am I? Doing inquiry, getting glimpses and tastes of their true nature, but their experience is still significantly colored by doubt, lack of confidence in the recognition of the true self, right? So what it can initially feel like is, I've heard it described in such a way that it's like the small self interacting with the small self. And this is what most therapeutic models actually really engage with, is we have people going into therapies and they don't have this fundamental recognition of who and what they are at the deepest level. And I've heard a gentleman called Spencer Brown actually he's a psychotherapist, somatic psychotherapist over in Nevada in the States, describe that he actually thinks that it's malpractice for people to go into therapy without the recognition of their true self. So that's how important this recognition can be. And we'll get into why that is. But until we recognize the true self, until we recognize who and what we are, it's like a small self going into a boxing ring with a small self trying to improve the other one by hammering it, or something like that, some sort of analogy like that, where the small self interacting with another small self piece is like I'm this egoic identity. I'm fully identified with this entity, this being that is engaging with another part or program within my system, and I'm tussling with it. I'm rolling around doing jujitsu on it, trying to rear naked choke and heal with my hammer this broken part of myself that is causing me grief and mischief in my life. And as I was talking to my partner about this before I actually got up and shot this podcast, I was just sort of like in conversation with her about this. And before she had her awakening, she had a good analogy. Like she studied a course called Theta Healing for doing healing work. And she actually had the instinct at that point in her life that when she was doing it, when she was engaging in the process and doing healing work, that it still felt off. Like something felt off. There was something missing. And I reflect back on my experience when I initially, like I went through a little bit of therapy earlier on in like 2019. I remember thinking the same thing, engaging with a therapist who prescribed me a certain set of actions that I could take in daily life to negate the suffering that I was experiencing at that time in the workplace when I was working as a cardiac technician. I remember just thinking like, this isn't it. Like this just doesn't feel right. And I know now, I think what I intuited in that moment was that the right context for true transformation wasn't there. Because again, it was like the small self, the ego, essentially interacting with another ego piece, trying to wrestle it, trying to do what it can to sort of like subdue and rear naked choke these parts in my experience, or sort of like band-aid. If I were to describe what it felt like a band-aid being put onto experience in order to subdue these parts. And ultimately, it didn't really work. Now, and of course, I'm not saying therapy is bad if you're in therapy or if you're doing anything like that. These are all excellent things to be doing, without a doubt. Although it definitely does get augmented, I would believe that it augments the therapeutic experience when we have the right context in which we're doing the work, which is through the lens, the recognition and the abiding in the true self. So already, if you're in that camp that I mentioned, that you're in this space where you're doing self-inquiry, like you're asking, who am I? What is this? You're really earnestly working toward this first awakening, or you're doing self-inquiry in some way, shape, or form, and you're not fully confident in the recognition of the true self. This can spark doubt and like frustration and even more helplessness to hear me say something like this. Because you might be thinking to yourself like, oh man, like I just can't, for whatever reason, man, I'm so broken and I just can't have this awakening. I'm trying everything, and now you're telling me that I need to have an awakening in order to do meaningful work, and I'm already suffering so much. It's like, man, give me a break, Sam. The good news is what you're speaking from, if you're experiencing that, is a form of doubt. And you're already on the path. You're already doing the work. If you're having a lot of doubt, just recognize that's one doubt. It's just one single thought. And then you can orient your attention back to who and what is aware of that doubt. And just relax and just feel your body, feel the contractions. With your heart aligned toward truth and love, these are the values that I hold dearly. If you pray into that, into the recognition of who and what you are, even if you're suffering, even if you feel like it's impossible, even if you've been at this for quite a while now, years even, with that true heartfelt orientation toward truth, you'll be guided there. Spirit will show up for you. So if we're in the other side of the camp, where we've had a recognition of the true self, we can now start to talk about some of the ways in which the true self recognition can benefit us if we're interested in integrating the awakening into daily life and healing the heart at the deepest level. But before we do that, I thought it would be beneficial to drop in a little bit, to actually experientially abide in this space. And maybe you're already there. Maybe you're already feeling this indirect experience, the true self. So let's just take a moment collectively as we listen to this podcast here to feel the weight of our bodies on the chair. Or if you're standing, walking around, just feeling the contact of your feet on the ground. And by the way, if you're driving or anything like that, I wouldn't recommend doing this. But, most people do anyway. Just be careful. Know your limits. Trust yourself. If you feel like you're disorienting yourself by doing a practice like this, and you're in a high-risk situation, just don't do it. Just feel the weight of your body in whatever way, shape, or form. And then let's move into the location of the body where you feel sensation the loudest. So often that could be a bodily contraction, or it could be a degree of pleasantness, curiosity, excitement. Just allow your attention to go into that. If we're talking about non-dual seekers and emotional distress, usually we're going to be experiencing some degree of contraction. So let's feel for that. Maybe in the gut. Just coming at it with a sense of neutrality, like we're just observing it as it is. It can be what it is, even if we're in a significant amount of dysregulation. And with attention in the body, let's just ask the question, who or what is aware of this sensation in the body? And energetically, this is like a sort of taking the backwards step. Leaning backward. Scuba diving, falling backward into the water, sinking down into the water, lifelessly. And just connecting to that spaciousness in experience. And if the doubts are arising, I don't know, I don't even know what he's talking about. What does it mean to energetically fall backwards? Just notice that thought. Or I can't even concentrate right now, I'm not doing it right. Just notice that thought. Come close to it energetically, as if you're crawling toward it. Again, just having a little bit of attention in the body, and then letting your attention float outwardly. And just rest here. So as you listen to my voice for the rest of this podcast, and as you engage with what you do, with whatever you're doing, as you listen to this podcast, see if you can just keep that spaciousness of attention sort of anchored. You could feel your body while connecting to that spaciousness. And that spaciousness, that is the key ingredient to transformation. The qualities of such spaciousness, depending on how we orient, could be slightly pleasant. So if we have a gentle intention of loving attunement toward this space, just a gentle intention of, can I connect to love? And can I feel that through the lens of this spaciousness? We can connect to that sense of pleasantness and that spaciousness. We could also notice that it is completely unnameable. No words can describe that sense of spaciousness, even though I talk about it now, but it's completely ineffable, unnameable. You can also notice that it's completely timeless. Time can only be referenced as a single thought in experience. But when we're in that spaciousness, there's no time. It's just what's here, right now. Until a thought comes and then thinks about the future. And like I mentioned, it's also spacious. You can connect to that spaciousness. Michael Taft calls this presence vast sky mind. So why would we want to connect to this? Well, if you can notice these qualities that we're talking about, and then we contrast, right? And that implies duality, contrast, right? Ultimately, what we do come to realize is that presence is interpenetrating everything and anything in experience. So that while initially there can be somewhat of a degree of apparent separation between this awake, spacious presence, we actually begin to notice that it interpenetrates all things, including sensation, and even including thought. We can realize that this spaciousness, it's an infinite container that can hold anything and everything. When we let our attention drift into it, we know damn well that there is a subtle shift. At first, that shift can be very difficult to access. It can feel very thin, and then it's quickly colored by somewhat of a doubt of, is this it? Is this not it? I don't know. And it feels very veiled, our true nature. Or quickly gets veiled. So this is like early recognition of our true self that we might encounter when we're still doing a lot of self-inquiry to work toward initial awakening. But as we deepen, as we keep letting our attention abide in that spaciousness by asking a question like, who am I? Or what is this? We start to develop more of a relationship with that presence so that it deepens. Almost as if the more that we give our attention to that spaciousness, the more that we allow ourselves to become familiar with that spaciousness, with consciousness, with awareness, wherever that question of who am I points to. That quality begins to deepen more and more and more. In my experience, that played out in the way that I just described. Initially, it was very thin, and I had a lot of doubt as to whether or not I had recognized my true nature or not, because for me, this that recognition of the true self has been very gradual. There was no huge platonic shift where the tectonic plates of reality opened up and then it was all bliss. As I hear for some people, they have a huge honeymoon period. But for me, it's always been quite gradual recognition. But the bottom line is that the more that we give our attention to that spaciousness, the more that it deepens to where it just becomes so obvious and so second nature and so stabilized that it can't be overlooked, because it exists in all things and everything. That sense of spaciousness. It's the masculine energy. It's the container that holds all things. And we need a container to hold all things, all the feminine content, right? I'm talking archetypal energies here, masculine, feminine, yin and yang, fire and water. We need that container to hold everything, especially when we're working with trauma, right? Especially when we're doing the deep emotional repression work, the deep shadow work that uncovers our very deep and insidious programs that have been running in our nervous system, in the depths of our heart since childhood, right? The shadow accrues through childhood and even cross-generationally from our ancestors passing trauma down to us through our lineage, which then gets passed on to our mothers and fathers, which then gets passed on down to us. When we're doing that really deep and emotion work, shadow work, which I do with people, which by the way I want to be doing with people in my upcoming 90-day program that I'll be releasing for people, for non-dual seekers who are serious about the emotional integration aspect and regulating themselves and being their more authentic self and showing up in daily life. We need this container. And even if we've only had a glimpse, for some people who have only had a glimpse, that's okay. That we can still work with that. Because often what is followed by a glimpse or somebody who's uncertain about the recognition of their true nature, speaking from experience as someone who's gone through it, is doubt. Oh, doubt, my old friend. And doubt, what is it? It's just an emotion. And that can even be attuned to with shadow work as well, to subdue and calm down that doubting apparatus so that we can be rested in our true nature without such doubts continuously bombarding us. So the key contrast here, though, is that if we're a small self, engaging with a small self, like I was, as I talked about with early therapy in 2019, wrestling one part, wrestling with another part, like the healer identity part, wrestling with the self-sabotaging part, then we're going to struggle. And for me, that felt intuitively wrong. But if we have this recognition of the container that holds all things, which is a taking of a backward step in experience by asking a question that can get us there. Who am I? What is this? Then all of a sudden we have this ocean of space, when previously it was as if we had a jar of hornets and we were in the jar trying to fix and kill all the hornets or something. But now it's like when we take this backward step, it's essentially like taking off the lid, where the radius of the beingness expands more and more around that jar so that it contains the jar, but it also is unnamably vast, just like an ocean containing the jar and everything in and between. But to even give it boundary by saying it's in and between is adding too much, right? Because again, if we feel into that unnamable quality, free and devoid of thought. It's just space. So the more that we can rest in that spaciousness, the more that we develop a relationship with it, the better. Because if we have that vast spaciousness and we attune to it more and more, such that we realize that it is our true self, then anything that is not our true self all of a sudden gains all of this volume around it. So that even if I had a self-sabotaging experience arise into awareness, like, you're not good enough, or you're an idiot, or you can't do that thing, you can't be your authentic self in this experience, and that's felt in the body as a contraction, right? So it's like having hornets in a jar firing off. We're outside of the jar now, and it's almost like now that rather than being inside the jar stuck with those hornets, we have all of this space around the outside of this program that's running. And intuitively and deep down, we know that this is not who we truly are, this program. We're not this program of I'm an idiot. We're not this program of I'm weak. We're not this program of I need to get away. Doesn't mean that we won't feel this program. There can be a trap here where some people who initially have an awakening, who aren't embodying the awakening, don't feel the sensations and have become so good at dissociating from the sensation field such that there is a significant and serious bypass from experience going on. So that's why I recommend, if you haven't already seen the episode I did, not as a podcast, I launched this podcast after this video that I released, but the 72 minutes of no BS embodiment advice, I would recommend that you check that episode out, because I talk about the nuanced applications of how we can become embodied to start doing this work, which is another foundational piece in adjunct, in tandem with recognizing our true nature. These two go hand in hand if we're serious about waking up and integrating the heart into daily life. The presence and the embodiment are pillars, foundational pillars for the deep work, which then progresses into somatic shadow work, which is what I do with people in person, and which is what I will be doing in this program I'm going to be launching over 90 days with people who are really serious. So we need that space. We need that space in awareness. And experientially, what this can feel like is like a vast blue sky, and I'm looking up at the clouds through a window right now as I do this podcast. I see gray clouds in the sky. I even see birds flying around. So there are pleasant things in the sky as well. There's not just darkness. We might have pleasant sensations of joy and happiness, birds flitting around in the sky. And we may have dark, stormy clouds. And it's really beautiful, actually. Right now, in this analogy, I can see different gradations of cloud. There's like really dark cloud. There's really light cloud. And that could represent the emotional spectrum of heaviness to lightness. But yet behind all of that and containing and interpenetrating the clouds is the blue sky, is awareness, is our true self. And that's the perfect analogy for experience. So that, I won't talk about this so much in this episode, as it relates to doing shadow work. But now when if, for example, we noticed a trigger arise in experience, like a painful emotional contraction, habituated emotional contraction that emerged from the shadow when the right causes and conditions arise, rather than succumbing and falling immediately into this reactive pattern and thus, reinforcing that pattern in our experience, now all of a sudden we have this spaciousness around it, and which is what gives us leverage to then do the deep work. So, and you can also imagine if we're doing somatic shadow work, where we're going into these emotional experiences, we all of a sudden have this shared mutual relationship where we're both orienting from presence and looking at very personal but simultaneously impersonal content and experience that's arising. Like, I'm not enough. All of a sudden that I'm not enough, it's just content. It's just like a cloud in the sky. You didn't choose to have a program like that. And you know damn well in your experience that as you orient to presence, you just see it as a ephemeral arising. Now, interestingly, sometimes there can be some content that can arise in experience, especially things like frozen emotions, really painful, deep guttural contractions in the body that even as we orient from presence, there can be a certain gravitational pull to these patterns that can really suck you into feeling like a small self. And it can feel really difficult and evasive to even find somewhat of a connection at all to presence. But as we continue to deepen in that recognition through resting as awareness, we begin to see through lived experience that even the most painful and difficult contractions arising in experience, we can get leverage on them. We can get leverage on timeless, ageless programs through the recognition of presence to really alchemize the heart. Things like social anxiety that are just chronically difficult to get leverage on and to see clearly in the moment. When we get that spaciousness, that's what gives us access. Or things like self-doubt, things like self-sabotage, things like relational issues. I can't tell you, if I didn't have this recognition of presence in my relationship, I don't see how I would have been able to face a lot of the avoidant conditioning that's arisen in my experience, avoidant attachment style. And honestly, I would have definitely left a relationship a long time ago if I didn't have that skill to see these most foundational and challenging conditionings that arise and take ownership for them. It's the sort of thing that makes you see, of course, people who haven't had this recognition, who don't have some degree of insight into their true nature, of course they succumb to these deep conditionings, right? They can be incredibly painful, but when we have this vast spaciousness, there's our refuge. We always have a refuge in our heart that we can soften back into, that we can free fall back into. And I always love that analogy. Like, no matter what you're feeling, even if you're encountering stuff like suicidal ideation, you know that's not who and what you are when you recognize your true nature. You always have that refuge in your heart. And there's always ways you can resource yourself even more if you get to a place like that, of course. Like you can, like I said in the previous episode, the recognition of and inviting guardians, figures of light, or some sort of like way of resourcing yourself into and infusing that experience to give you a little bit more of a buffer. Calling upon the energy of like Jesus, or just any archetypal figure that we can connect to, can be a really powerful way to get a little bit more leverage on the experience, which science has shown the mind doesn't know the difference between mental images of these sorts, because it creates the same feeling of safety filling our nervous system. So these are extra little ways. I'll just drop in a little bit more masala on how we can regulate ourselves. Now, this is why a gentleman that I really respect, Thomas Hübl, really famous German teacher who teaches these sorts of principles. He has this way of talking about presence, which I definitely agree with, which is essentially that the greater your capacity to be with that spaciousness in experience, to rest in your true nature, the greater the amount of content that you can hold. In fact, it's directly correlated. The capacity to be in your true nature is directly correlated with how much you can hold in experience, emotionally, somatically. And when I'm working with people, this is, as I sort of alluded to before, this is the foundational piece. We want to be orienting from this place of presence when we're doing the deep somatic work and doing the deep transformative work, ideally. Although not fully necessarily, we can definitely, if we're glimpsing or haven't fully recognized our true nature, we can definitely still do profound work. And what this spaciousness experientially, if I were to drop in with you right now, if you're still connected to that spaciousness from that guided meditation that we did, if not, you can just reconnect and feel in your body, feel sensation, whatever you're noticing, even if it's pleasant. It's like the bird in the sky, or if it's like a dark, stormy cloud of emotional numbness deep in the gut. Whatever it is, we just feel that. Right? And not taking it on as it is some really difficult attunement that we need to really brute force ourselves to realize, and doubting ourselves and then beating ourselves up, yada, yada, yada. All the things the mind can do in these subtle ways. But we just drop the question, well, who's aware of this sensation? And look in direct experience. Not looking for a mental image. That's obviously another thing that we can do. We can mistake a mental image of spaciousness as the experiential recognition and abiding in awareness. But if we just notice that mental image as a thought, what's aware of that? Just take that backward step and abide there. And then from that spaciousness, we gently coalesce our attention into sensation. So we have that sense of embodied spaciousness of knowing our true nature with the sense of heartfelt knowingness of who and what we are, while also simultaneously feeling the sensation, just crawling gently and closely toward that sensation as best we can. And again, I feel inclined to say, if there's a doubt arising, what's Sam talking about, man? What the hell is this about? We just notice that sensation of doubt. Notice the thought. Notice the energetic signature in the body that feels like it's curling up into a ball, like it doesn't know what's going on. And just what's aware of that? And basically what this feels like is, it feels like if we have a sensation in the body, like just like I mentioned in that example, say like a tension in the gut, we have that intuitive sense of knowingness of who and what we are. So it feels wider, feels more spacious around that sensation. Until then, we're almost like coalesced into and unconsciously are enacting that program out in our lives. But then we have this spaciousness around it, and it literally can feel almost like a wavelength on a radio station that we attune to. And around that sensation, and this becomes more and more obvious just simply the more that we give our attention to, and as we abide as presence, awareness, consciousness, whatever word you want to use, all the same thing. And it feels like there's space around this sensation, literally as if we're feeling all of a sudden there's like a radius around a dense energy, that can extend outwardly infinitely. Again, just to use that hornet jar analogy, it's like the hornet can still sting, but then when we attune to this spaciousness, we've taken off the lid, and all of a sudden there's this vast container around it that it can swim around in and the hornets can fly around in. And yeah, they might bite, but we can see them clearly and feel them very clearly. They're spongier, more volumetric. And from that place, we can get leverage on them to work on them, where we can feel into deep, deep, buried layers of repressed emotion, repressed sadness, rage, the foundational building blocks that these identities of smallness are built upon, that are very deep and buried and unconscious, that require active effort rather than just rest as awareness, brah. Just rest as awareness and just feel it arising, and don't worry about shadow work. That's those people, those poor deluded people doing shadow work, right? Trying to heal. There's no one to heal. Fuck off. Obviously, there's value in any degree of pointing, and we don't want to fixate on any certain view. But let's go into the depths of the unconscious and meet our real, deep human experience, rather than trying to spiritualize and spiritual superiority our way out of things by thinking that we've transcended it all into love and unity consciousness. And then we'll pretend that when we then get into a very triggering situation in a relationship, like what happens in real life, that we don't have dysfunction playing out, and just call it love consciousness, and then project our unconscious shadows onto these poor people and hurt them to stay safe in awareness. Bit of a rant there, but sometimes we need to shake it up a little bit and get real with ourselves. But ultimately, that recognition of spaciousness is important, but I just illuminated a fixation there that if we give all of our energy to that without the embodiment piece, without looking into the unconscious and having a willingness where non-dual doubts can arise, like, well, there's no one to do anything. Isn't this too much? I'm injecting too much effort where I just need to surrender to reality or something like that. Yeah, and then we just need to ask the question, well, how's my life playing out? Like, what am I noticing in my life when I just surrender like that? I'm obviously, trust your instinct. Don't just take my word for it. But if you're seeing dysfunction playing out in your life, where you're acting unconsciously in relationship, you're recurrently experiencing emotional distress and these sorts of things, well, maybe we need to look into the unconscious, but hold it through the lens of this spaciousness. Just subtle attunements, subtle adjustments here. But yeah, if you guys are interested, I am taking these principles, and I would encourage you to check out more of the podcast episodes that go deeper into these sorts of concepts. So this one's on presence, obviously, but the previous one I talked about working with freeze energy. And I've also done a podcast episode on, well, it wasn't really a podcast at that time, as I said, but on embodiment, which is a foundational skill that we can cultivate, which is essential for doing the deep healing work, to access and awaken the heart more, to be in the body, to be feeling the sensations. I would encourage you to check out that episode as well. I'll put links in the description of this episode. But yeah, and I'm also going to be launching a program, a combination of modules alongside working intimately one-on-one alongside me over 90 days to look at your core shadows, the things holding you back the most in life, that are preventing you from essentially living and stepping into your most authentic, empowered, and regulated self in daily life. We'll be tackling those things head on and really looking at that in a progressive way over 90 days, where I really want to go deep with people, and just give them that platform where the platform I wish I had. So I'm trying to scratch my own itch, essentially, for that. I think back to that non-dual seeker, man, who was just meditating in his room, really deeply in his heart, wanting to engage more with the world, but being so scared, and co-opting these sorts of presence and Eastern teachings to get away from life. But ultimately, we have to engage with life as householders. And yeah, it's difficult, but that's why we need support. And sometimes it can be difficult to reach out because we're so much in the business of trying to transcend our pain so that we can finally be socially acceptable. Like, this is the avoidant spiritual path that I essentially went down as well. That it can be difficult to ask for help. It can be difficult to do this. But at some point we got to bite the bullet, or I don't even know if that's a saying, but at some point we can honestly and humbly admit to ourselves that, yeah, you know what, I need support. And it's not so much that I'm in a place of superiority to you, although it can even be helpful as someone who's more experienced to just have that person walking side by side with them who understands the struggle, who knows what it's like to be in the darkest points in the human experience, who actually understands and has the insight to walk side by side with someone and help them and encourage them to step into their best life by looking at the things that they're most afraid of head on, in a space of impersonality, deep personal impersonality, where we know through orienting to presence that all of this content isn't who and what we are. Yet it's still, when we get honest with ourselves, is contributing to a significant amount of suffering, and we need to face it rather than keep running from it and bypassing in resting as awareness. So that's why we need balance, embodiment, presence, and much more to come in future episodes. So if you're interested in getting that sort of support, check out and sign up to the newsletter. I think that's probably the best way I'm going to communicate it at this point, when it launches. But check that out and sign up to that newsletter. It'll be at the bottom of the page. Also, my friends, if you think anyone else will find this sort of content valuable, please do me a tremendous favor, and them, if you think it will be helpful for them, to share it with them. People who are really fitting this picture I'm painting of that sort of, like, as I was myself 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this non-dual seeker ardently pursuing spirituality, who's sort of, we're looking in the heart spaces and we're ready to accept and integrate our heart at the deepest level, to step in and walk that paradoxical line of integration and disintegration, being and non-being. And drop a comment as well, what you got the most out of this podcast. I'm definitely keen to hear what you found valuable. And like the video, subscribe, and let me know if you have any feedback or comments. I've never really done a podcast like this before, so definitely open to feedback, whether you like the name or not. The Grounded Seeker, I don't know if that sounds kind of lame, or what you think about that.